Hi, and welcome. My name is Jessica White. This is a re-recording of a talk that I gave for the first Virtual Arts Fest that was hosted by the Downtown Asheville Arts District in May of 2020. We had some technical issues at the time, so we don't have a recording of the original talk, but I'm going to do my best to recreate it here. So first of all, I want to say many thanks to the Downtown Asheville Arts District for creating this festival. One of Asheville's identities really revolves around supporting the arts and the artists that live here. So I want to just say thanks to them for bringing it into our homes when we can't go down to experience it in person during this time of shutdowns and social distancing because of COVID-19. I also wanted to say thanks to Blue Spiral One for inviting me to give this talk. They are going to open their doors with limited hours starting June 3rd. But they also have many things still available at their website, which is www.bluespiral1.com. You can also contact them to make an appointment to see the gallery. All of my prints that are still available are sold through this gallery. So if you see anything that you're interested in during this talk, feel free to contact them about it. So I want to say welcome to my home. This is where I've moved most of my art studio supplies, at least the most important ones for right now, so that I can continue working during this home isolation time. I've also moved all of my school supplies in order to move classes online, teaching here from home as well. So I'm sort of in this guest bedroom basically. So for that reason, I'm not going to show you around my makeshift studio this time, but I do have a few things that I've set aside right here that I'm going to show you and talk about. So when I was first invited by Blue Spiral One to give this talk, I really jumped at the chance because a lot of people don't know what they're looking at when they're looking at prints. And it totally makes sense. If you are one of those people who is confused by all this strange terminology, you're not the only one. It can be really confusing and almost a little bit mysterious. You know, what's the difference between lithography and photogravure? What is the difference between etching and engraving? I think part of the mystery for a lot of people is because printmaking tends to be an indirect method, not as much of a direct method. So what do I mean when I say direct method? I'm talking about methods such as painting, applying paint directly to canvas with whatever tools that you're using. And then what you're finished with is the work that the artist put into it, very direct method. Same thing with carving a block of wood to create a piece of sculpture. The block of wood that the sculptor worked on is then the finished work of art. You can see the work that the artist put into the finished work itself. However, when we're talking about printmaking being an indirect method, it's one of the cases where if you see a print hanging on a wall in a gallery, it might look like this. And you see ink on paper, but you maybe cannot quite tell that most of the work that I put into that print was actually working on a block of wood itself. So what's happened is that I've put time into carving this block of wood. I've put a layer of ink on top of it, transferred the ink onto a piece of paper. So in a way, this is not the paper, the print then is not really the work itself, but it's evidence of the work that I put into this block that I've created. And this is why there's that little veil of mystery over printmaking sometimes, because it's not always obvious when you're looking at a print how the artist created that print. Part of the reason I really, the printmaking work really appeals to me is because of, as there's a sculpture side of me. I was actually a sculpture major as an undergrad, and I love working with materials like wood and metal, and printmaking gives me a chance to work in these kinds of materials, very hands-on, very tactile kind of work, but still have a finished result that's also very pleasing in its own different way. So there are four predominant printmaking methods. One of them is planography or lithography. It's referring to creating prints off of a surface, a flat surface, and a lot of it refers to the idea of how oil and water repels itself, especially in lithography. A second method is stenciling or silkscreen, most of you might be familiar with. And in that case, you're taking a screen, you're blocking it out with a stencil, and then you're putting ink into it, and then you squeeze ink through the screen, and the ink that is then transferred to the paper is the print. Method number 3 would be something like intaglio, where you take a metal plate, incise grooves into the metal plate, and when you put the ink onto those grooves, it sinks in, you wipe off the surface, and with dampened paper, you put it through a press under very, very high pressure, and the paper actually gets embedded into those little grooves, and it pulls the ink right out, and that's the resulting print. And then the fourth main method of printmaking is relief, which is basically working off of a surface. So what you have is a surface of a material like a linoleum or wood block. You carve away at it, and what's carved away is left white. And what is remaining gets a layer of ink on top. A piece of paper is placed on top. You put that through a printing press under less pressure than with intaglio or an etching. And then the ink just gets transferred to a piece of paper. So it's really about what's remaining on the surface of that block that you've worked on. I primarily work in relief, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So when you have this surface and ink is transferred on paper, what you have are basically that work that was put into the object, which is the plate or the block, and then the resulting print. This is one of the oldest printmaking methods. It's been done for thousands of years. And the way that this is typically done, what I'm showing you right now are engravings, but wood block is how it started, and it's from a plank of wood. And the way you remove the wood is with gouges, basically like these sharp knives that are shaped on the ends. This is a U gouge, a shallow U gouge. And then here's a smaller U gouge. And you're basically removing the material, the wood or the linoleum. And here's an example of a V gouge. It's a little bit of a V shape, and create a finer line with something like this. So you're removing the material with these kinds of gouges and then printing off of that, like I said, the remaining surface. I first started really getting into relief printing in grad school. But like most of you, I imagine some of you probably had experience with relief printing ever since you were a little kid. You know, I remember carving potatoes and making potato prints, and carving erasers and making little stamps with erasers. And I remember in high school is when I first really got started in printmaking, really enjoying it. Took a little break and got into sculpture for a while as an undergrad. But then when I returned to grad school at Iowa, University of Iowa, that's when I really got into a lot of different types of printmaking, but I mostly just fell in love with relief printmaking. So a lot of what I was doing while I was in Iowa was a combination of a lot of different types of materials and bringing them together. And one of my favorite forms of printmaking there was letterpress printing. So here's an example of one of the prints that I made. And you can see that we have wood block here. These are made, the drawing part is made from photopolymer plates. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a little while. And then down here we have letterpress printed metal type. And all of this is printed on a letterpress printing press. And when I say a photopolymer plate, I have an example of one of these here. It is a plastic plate that is light sensitive. And what you can do is take a drawing, like you see here, and expose the plate through a negative. And basically the drawing itself is what's left remaining as a surface. Can you see there's a little bit of a surface there? So again, relief being printing from a surface. So the nice thing about these kinds of plates is that you can really print true to your drawing. So I was doing a lot of drawings at the time, and in that way I could make prints that looked a lot like my drawings without having to translate them into different materials. But what I really liked was just combining them with the other materials as well. So let's talk a little bit about what letterpress printing is. And in fact, I'm going to go to a slideshow and show you a few things about letterpress printing. So letterpress printing really has a lot to do with printing on letterpress being printing letters, so printing from metal or wood type. And here's a little example of what it looks like to set the metal type, like you saw in my previous print that's printed at the bottom of a page. Whoops, let me go back. So as you can see here, each individual piece of type is an individual letter. So I'm literally putting each letter one at a time in a row, adding spaces and putting them all together in this what's called the composing stick. And then I'm printing, one of my favorite printing presses is called the Vandercook proof press, and I print primarily on one of these. And here's an example of printing a wood engraving, but I also print the type on this type of press. Oops. Here we go. These are the presses that I primarily learned on while I was at University of Iowa. And you can see here there's type and a wood engraving together. And here again is an example of that polymer plate I just showed you. In this case, what you can see is I tried printing it with a wooden spoon, and you can see right here, it's very nice and clear where the image is and how it's very much just like my drawing, but on with a hand printing process, like using a spoon, there's a tendency to pick up some ink that's kind of left behind. So that's one of the benefits of having a nice printing press to print with. So again, here is the print that I just showed earlier. It's called Bigger Signs, and it's a combination of wood block, which is in the waves up here. This is a 2-color wood block print. Although the line drawings are made from polymer, are printed from photopolymer plates, and then down here is a line of metal type. So while I was at University of Iowa, and soon after when I moved to Asheville, I worked with in this kind of process, a combination of polymer plates and wood blocks, or sometimes linoleum blocks combined with metal type. And there are times when I wanted to add just a little bit of a hand touch. So there's some hand coloring here in the fire and a little bit of blue that I hand colored in here as well. And you can see they kind of vary depending on how much polymer plate or how much wood type I use. So in this case, I'm sorry, the wood block I use. So in this case, the block print, I think this was actually linoleum. It's a fairly small amount. It's just these ghost wolves that are in the forest. Everything else is printed from photopolymer plates. Now, I was also interested in and was exposed to a little bit of wood engraving while I was in grad school, and I did want to incorporate it into some of my prints, but wood engraving is a very more time-consuming process. You tend to work much smaller. So in order to stay at the size that I was working in, I combined wood engravings. These are the wood engravings here, the more detailed little bits, with the larger wood blocks that you see in the background. And here's another example where the background is a larger wood block print, and then this small area here is cut from wood engraving with a little bit of hand coloring here in the lanterns. So I want to tell you a little bit about wood engraving. This is the elephant block and print that I was showing you earlier. It's slightly different than wood block cutting because you do get a lot more details in this different method. I'm going to come back to the screen, and I wanted to show you the tools are slightly different. So rather than having a U-shaped or a V-shaped gouge that removes a lot of material, these tools are much finer and much more detailed. They're these tiny little tips, very fine, sharp points, and in a way you're almost using them to scratch into the surface of the wood. Let's see if I can get, oh, you can see the face of it there pretty well. It's a very sharp tip. And that's how you're able to get really a lot of these super fine details. I'll come back and show you some more details that you really can't get using a gouge on a plank side wood. So what I'm talking about, the difference would be like looking at a table. Your tabletop is the plank side. And it's basically like if you were to have a tree fall over and you're looking at the log. It's the long ways. But if you're looking at a tree that's standing up and you're looking at the cross section, that's the end grain. And that's where you can get much finer details. Here's an example of end grain block. And you can still see that on this one, the bark is still remaining. So this is the difference between plank and end grain. And this one has a print on it. I'll show you the print in a little while, but you can see a little bit a hint of the bear that's been carved into it. So that shows you where I'm carving into it. And the reason I've switched over to wood engraving is because I really appreciate that fine detail that you can get from this tight end grain that I just can't get from other materials. And I really enjoy the fineness of the stippling and the fine lines, textures, and the patterns that I can get out of it that I really can't get with other materials. So in the past couple of years, a lot of my work has moved almost entirely into this direction. And I'm going to go back to the slideshow and show you a few of my recent prints in the past few years. So there's this series that I started working on called Beasts of Burden, and I wanted to emulate the look of a page out of a book, basically. Those earlier prints that I had shown you, actually, I'm going to go back real quick. I forgot to mention, these are supposed to have the look of sort of like a children's book illustration, and I wanted to have that feeling of a story that's being told from a children's book, and you're just seeing small parts of it here and there. And I wanted to sort of go deeper into that realm of this idea of my work being a part of a larger story, but a small part that you're only seeing a small part of. And you have to kind of, I'm asking the viewer basically to fill in the rest of their story on their own. So I sort of went into this place where I wanted to add more of that element of the book element into these prints. So here I added titles across the top with page numbers and an actual caption, and so and a torn edge. So it really looks like I just ripped it right out of a book and put it up on the wall. Along with that series, I'm also working on these small 6 inch by 6 inch prints. I started these about 5 years ago, and it was right about the time when I had my baby. So I really had to simplify my work in big ways. I had to simplify it and make it much smaller, and be able to work quickly and not have to stay too focused on one piece at a time. I needed to just be able to get some work out and keep moving, just to stay in motion and to feel like I was letting out my creativity when I really didn't have a whole lot of time because I was also a new mom. But I started on this series at that same time where I, instead of coming up with my own words for my captions, I found quotes that I felt were inspiring to me, and I combined them with these wood engravings. And I kind of also thought of these wood engravings as practice blocks in a way, because they are small, individual, but I was learning as I was working on these in order to apply them towards larger prints down the road. At the same time, I was kind of playing around a little bit with typesetting in different ways, like these curves that you see here. So I wanted to talk a little bit of the evolution of our relief engraving. Here I'm going to take you to my website where I laid out basically the steps of how I created one of my wood engravings. So as you can see here, it starts off with a sketch in my sketchbook, and this is maybe 2 or 3 iterations down the road. So this is kind of a cleaned up sketch. And after I finish creating the sketch that I like, I transfer it to a block. Now this block that you see here is not a wood block, but it's actually from corian, which is a kitchen countertop material that also lends itself really well to wood engraving or engraving printing processes, just because it takes really fine scratches and stippling really well. So I've stained it kind of this pinkish red and then drawn my design onto the surface of it. And I don't always start out with cutting out an outline, but in this case, I knew that there were going to be a lot of white areas I was going to remove down the road. So I ended up creating this outline image, and then I started creating a few of these stippled patterns, creating the light. You can see just a little bit in the sheep's head right here, and a little bit right down here, the anvil and the stool that they're all stacked up on top of. And I just keep working and keep working, adding lines, adding dots, little bit at a time until more and more images result. There's a difference here. You'll see that this is the block, And this is one of the first proofs. So it looks like you're looking at it in reverse. It's flipped around. So this is actually printed on a piece of paper. And again, this is what the block looks like after I've cleared out a lot of these white areas. If I have a small amount of white area, I just use an engraving tool that has a wider flat surface that can remove a lot of material. But in this case, I don't know if you can see a few of these marks here that were made by a Dremel tool. So when I have a lot to remove, I employ a Dremel tool to help so I can give my wrist a break. And you can see, again, here in the block, it's in reverse. So I do have to carve in reverse with the intention of printing, other way around. So after some final touches and some cleaning up here and there, this is the resulting print, the finished print. And here's a short video of that first one of the reveals of a proof print. So this is when the ink is transferred onto the paper, it's been passed through the printing press, and I'm pulling it off to see that first proof, just to see how it looks before I keep working on it. And the finished print was a commission by the Southern Highland Craft Guild for some of their rack cards. And they asked me to create a few designs for them, but this one in particular was to promote their events for 2018. So if you were out and about in Asheville during that time, you might have seen these on some of the rack displays. So a lot of my work falls into these main categories of prints. The larger color prints that are sort of like children's book illustrations. And I'm going to come back to the screen. So a lot of my work kind of falls into those categories of these larger children's illustration kind of prints, or the smaller wood engravings that are either the 6x6 prints or like the Beasts of Burden prints. But I really got into letterpress printing. One of my main loves was working as a book artist. So I did do some book printing while I was in grad school, not so much since I've moved to Asheville, but in the past couple of years, I did dabble a little bit in creating these things I call crankies. So I wanted to show you in the past, I think this was maybe, 2017, so 3 years ago. It's called The Calling. And what it is, it's a long print printed on a scroll, Japanese paper. And this is carved out of a rubber material called gomuban. It's kind of like linoleum, but it's softer and easier to print. And what I've done was attach it to these cranking mechanisms in a wooden box. And it works kind of like a scroll. You can just scroll through. And I think of this as kind of like a kinetic work of art, a lot like a book. So in that way, I had at the beginning, as you saw, a title page. And then here, I wanted to stop here. You can read the writing here. And then at the end is a little colophon that tells you about this book. And then I have one more called BioBay. And this is printed from the same material, the gomuban material, and the text is a poem that my husband, Scott Smith, wrote. And the story is about a trip that we took to see a bioluminescent bay in Puerto Rico. And I remember thinking that the bioluminescence in the water looked a lot like the stars up in the sky. So I wanted to make a print that reflected that. So those are my two, probably my most recent works, but just in the past year, I've started working on a new project that is a graphic woodcut or wood engraving graphic novel that's about my childhood years growing up in Taiwan and kind of figuring out my identity as an adult, thinking back on those years and the changes that I went through from moving to Taiwan. I want to show you a couple of those prints. I'm going to go back to presenting my screen. So here are 2 pages out of those, and the most recent show I was in at Blue Spiral had, I think 4 of these pages, and I'm still kind of working out the story, but I decided to go ahead and jump in and tell at least the parts that I knew. And a lot of these images are drawn from old family photographs, and then there are other pages that are more imaginative and imaginary images that I put into the story. It should have a look of kind of like a scrapbook or a diary in the end. That's the intention of it. So this brings me to the end of my talk. And at this point, I opened up the floor for any questions and answers. And I did get a question from one of the viewers asking me, how did I learn about crankies? And I had a pretty good story about this because it was kind of a big change for me. It was a big moment when I first saw a show by Anna and Elizabeth. They came to Warren Wilson College where I was teaching at the time and put on a show, and they told us about the history of crankies. And what they had was they're performing for us music, but at the same time they also had a cranky as part of their display. And what they told us was about the history of this Appalachian area where crankies were carried with traveling shows as a part of their performance. And what they would do was invite the whole village in, and they would come and watch them perform the music, which tended to be these ballads that told stories. But then they would also have a cranky, usually much larger than the ones that I just showed you, and usually made of fabric as well. And somebody would crank the scroll through, and it would illustrate the story that was being told in the song. So in that way, their shows became these full-on performances, and people would come out, and it would be like a big night on the town. And so it's really rooted in Appalachian history, and so that made me really want to explore it. I might be creating a couple more crankies, but I feel like I've gotten a few of them out of my system. So for now, I'm going to let them rest for a while and go back to some of my regular prints and this graphic novel that I'm working on for now. So another question that I got was, how has your work changed since starting to teach full-time? So I've just started teaching full-time at Warren Wilson College in 2018. I'm the printmaking professor there. And my answer at the original talk that I gave was that it hasn't really changed much because I'm continuing along some of these same themes and the same process and techniques that I've been working on. So I don't feel like some of these series that I've started on have are fully complete. So I'm still working on those. The only things that I've noticed that have changed is that I've thought a little bit more about changing up my processes so that because I have more access to different equipment and presses that I didn't have access to just because of the nature of the print studio at the school where I teach. So I'm very lucky to have that available to me. So there are a few projects I've thought of that I've considered maybe using the intaglio press to make an etching or something like that. I haven't gone there yet, but it's just sort of something that's simmering in my mind. So other than that, nothing's really changed, except I realized afterwards that this graphic novel that I'm working on is really a big change. I'm going to see if I have a few of these pages here available to show you. Here are a few more. So this is really a big change that I had forgotten about. This graphic novel that I'm working on is something that I've put off for actually a few years. I've been thinking about it for a long time, but I know that as I work on these pages that are intended to be a much larger story, they're not necessarily work that's going to appeal to a lot of people. I don't know if they are ever going to be shown in a gallery. So I just never really put aside the time that I needed to really delve into this. But now that I have steady income and a steady job, then I don't have to worry so much about my finances, basically. Like I can work on any project. I have this freedom now to work on projects that I maybe did not see as viable a few years ago. So that's one of the main things that has changed since beginning to teach is I feel like I can explore a little bit more, and it gives me that kind of a freedom that I didn't have before. So that concludes my talk. Thank you so much for watching. And thank you so much for those of you who came to my talk originally. And I hope that this has inspired some of you to try your hand at some printmaking. And I also hope that this helps explain what some prints are when you're looking at them on the walls and appreciate the work that's gone into them. I hope to see you around town in Asheville. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.